My name is Jim Comstock-Galligan, and I am an attorney who has specialized in disability rights work for the past 37 years. I have devoted my entire professional career to representing children, adolescents, and young adults with disabilities and their families on primarily education issues. Today I'm going to talk to you about one of the most fundamental of all education issues, and that is the issue of inclusion. I hope to give you some different ideas, but also useful ideas on how to think about the issue of inclusion and also how to advocate for the inclusion of your own children, be they children, adolescents, or young adults in schools and in all aspects of community life. One of the first things that I want to emphasize is that the issue of inclusion is not an issue that is reserved or is solely of interest to children, adolescents, and adults with disabilities and their families. Sometimes in our schools, they make it seem like inclusion is only an issue that involves kids with disabilities. It is not. Inclusion is an issue that matters to everyone. And today, we're going to talk about providing a context for adults who are the real decision makers for children in our schools, giving them a context to see this issue in a different light, and in a light that is a little more personal to them and a little more illuminating, I hope, for them. So let's begin. Fundamental to the issue of inclusion is the idea of accommodations. Accommodations are, in my view, the DNA of community life. They are the key to everyone's inclusion, and they are the key that unlocks the door to inclusion. Now, accommodations. Everybody needs accommodations to function in inclusive school, work, and community settings. As a result, one of the things I hope you learn from this presentation is that we are all far more alike than we are different. Accommodations, they are the universal thread of community life. They are also the linchpin or the anchor of all disability rights legislation in the past 40 years. This includes Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, otherwise known as IDEA, the Fair Housing Act amendments, FHAA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which goes by the acronym, the ADA. Now, each of these laws has as its anchor the issue of accommodations. Today, however, in my view, far too few accommodations are being made for students with disabilities in our schools. And the result is too many students with disabilities who could function in inclusive settings, because they are denied the accommodations that they need, end up too often in segregated, self-contained classrooms. So let's look at this issue of inclusion. Here's the irony and the issue of accommodations. Here's the irony about accommodations. Every human needs accommodations to function and thrive in community life and in inclusive settings in community life. Numerous accommodations are made for each and every one of us, each and every day in the community, be it our house, be it our job, be it a public accommodation that we've entered. Numerous accommodations are made throughout the community so that we can function in inclusive settings. If we were in a conference room today, and like this was a conference and I was presenting to all of you in a large room, there would be numerous accommodations that would be made for us so that we could have a meeting where all of us were there and where this presentation could be made. So let's think about it. Imagine you're in a conference room. Here we are, we're at some hotel, the Hyatt somewhere. We're in the conference room now, I'm presenting. What are some of the accommodations that are being made for us so that we can have this presentation? Now think about it. The first one most people come up with is lights. Why do we have lights? You know, a basic human limitation is, unless you have a visual impairment or a visually challenged, we don't function very well in the dark. In fact, we don't function, some of us don't function at all in the dark. So a basic human limitation is we don't do very well in the dark. So in order to accommodate that, we have created lights. A second thing that we find in the room. In January, we would typically, let's say we're presenting in St. Louis, the heat would be on. Why? Because as humans, we don't do very well. Another human limitation we have is we don't function very well when we're cold. So if it's 25 degrees outside, imagine being in a conference room for a presentation where it's 25 degrees. People are not going to be focusing on what I have to say, and really are going to want to get someplace that is warm. So that's another basic human limitation that we have. So we've created artificial heat to accommodate that. If we were presenting and making this present, if I was making it in New Orleans in July, what would be on? The air conditioning. Because the reality is, not only do we not function very well when we're cold, we don't function very well when we're warm. That's another human limitation we have. You know, if the temperature rises above about 80 degrees, we're warm, we're uncomfortable, and we're going to be looking for someplace cool. So we have created artificial cooling in order to address that human limitation. What else would we see in this conference room that I'm presenting in today? You would all be sitting in what? Chairs. Imagine attending a conference and having to stand for 8 hours. Another basic human limitation that we have is we cannot stand for 8 hours at a time. So we have created chairs so that we can sit and address that human limitation that we have. And in front of the chairs that you would be sitting in, what would there be? There would be a table. And why do we have tables? Because imagine, going back to the standing example, having to stand for 8 hours and hold all your stuff, your computer, your briefcase, your purse, whatever, your conference materials. Imagine that. You know, we wouldn't do very well standing. And even sitting, how well would we do if we had all that in our lap? Not very well. So we have created tables to address another human limitation that we have. You know, we're not going to do very well with everything in our lap. So one of the other things that I would be using would be a microphone. That because as human beings, another basic human limitation we have is if we're more than about 50 feet apart, we can't hear each other. So microphones were created to amplify our voices so that our voices will carry more than 50 feet. It accommodates that human limitation of not being able to communicate more than like 50 feet at any one time. We would also see that there would be a screen and probably an LCD projector because it's a visual aid. It accommodates those who are visual learners. Those who are auditory learners, they could pick it up through the microphone. But those who are visual learners, to address the human limitation that not all people are auditory learners and not all people are visual learners, we provide both microphones and screens. You can be sure there would be a restroom in the facility. Because imagine going to a conference and there not being a restroom for the 8 hours that you're there. The basic human limitation that we have, at least most of us, is that we're going to need to use a restroom at least once, if not 2 or 3 times over an 8-hour period. So we have accommodated that basic human limitation. We need a restroom by creating them. And let's talk about how you got into this conference room in the first place. If it's on the second, let's say it's on the 4th floor of a hotel. You took an elevator to get into that conference room where I'm speaking. The reason for that is because as human beings, one of our human limitations is we do not fly. We cannot fly. So we have accommodated that human limitation by creating elevators so that we can move people to places they couldn't get otherwise. But that accommodates the human limitation. Coming in the building, there were either steps or there was a ramp. Hopefully there was a ramp. But the thing about steps is Every set of steps you've ever encountered in your life is an accommodation to a basic human limitation that we all have. We don't fly. And if something sits more than about a foot off the ground, we're going to need steps. But the problem with steps is not everybody can use them. They are an accommodation to a human limitation, the fact that we can't fly, but not everybody can use them. The thing about a ramp is it accommodates the same human limitation, people's inability to fly. But everybody can use a ramp. So right now we've seen that this presentation I'm doing at this hypothetical conference, here's the accommodations we have for it. We have steps and/or a ramp. Hopefully the ramp is there. That's one accommodation. We have an elevator. That's two. We have lights. We have heat or AC. We have chairs. We have tables. We have microphones. We have screens. These are all accommodations that are being made for us so that we can function in an inclusive environment. Somewhere between typically 10 and 14 accommodations for any conference presentation. Because they're also going to be giving you pens and pencils. And the pens, pencils, and papers. And the reason we have pens and paper is because if we don't write things down, another human limitation is we don't remember them. In fact, we only remember 10% of what we hear. That doesn't bode too well for me. But, you know, the reality is we therefore have created pens and paper to accommodate that human limitation, that 90% is just going right through us or around us or over us. So pens and papers are another accommodation to a basic human limitation that we have. So everywhere you go in your daily life, accommodations are being made for us and you and me, so that we can function in inclusive settings. Now, accommodations. Think you don't use them? Think again. This woman in this picture is at a work site that may be one of the most common work sites in America. She's in an office working. She could be a lawyer, a doctor, architect, engineer. She could be a legal secretary. She could be the head of a high-tech corporation. There's any number of things she could be, but she's working in an office setting. Now, just look at this picture and start counting how many accommodations have been made for her. And if it was a man, the same would be true for him. Whether he was a legal secretary or a doctor, lawyer, accountant, engineer, high-tech exec, whatever, it would look exactly the same. Now, look at how many accommodations have been provided to this person so that they can function in what is now considered probably one of the most common work sites in America. Let's start with what? Look at the picture. We're going to count every single one of these accommodations so that we can begin to understand how thoroughly we have accommodated ourselves so that we can function in inclusive environments. The first thing you're going to notice is the lights are on. She's not in the dark. You can be sure she's grateful for that. I would be too. She also has a lamp. She has additional supplemental lighting in a lamp. You can be sure she also has heat or AC. She has a chair she's sitting in. She has a desk. She has a telephone. Now, how is a telephone an accommodation? Telephone accommodates this very basic human limitation, as I noted before, similar to the microphone. We can't communicate with people who are more than about 50 feet away. So we have accommodated that basic human limitation by creating telephones. I mean, imagine me sitting here in New Orleans today doing this presentation, and I have a brother who lives in Seattle who's a writer, and saying to my brother Joe right now, "Hey Joe, how are you? How you doing? What's the latest book you're working on?" Does anyone think he's going to answer? No, he can't hear me. But if I picked up my cell phone and dialed his number, I would be able to communicate with him 3,000 miles from New Orleans. Telephones are accommodations to a very basic human limitation that we have. This woman has one in her office. She also has a stapler, because if we don't staple things together, what happens to them? Another basic human limitation that we have is the vast majority of people are not very well organized. They're going to lose things if they don't staple. She also has a paperclip holder. Paperclips serve the same function. She has a date stamp next to the stapler. Why do we date stamp sensitive, date-sensitive materials? Because another human limitation that we have is if we don't date stamp things when they come in, 3 days later, we're not going to remember what day they came in. That's a basic human limitation that we have. She has a computer and a keyboard. She has a printer. She also has a calendar. It's red and white. It's just to the right of her mouse, or just in front of her mouse. That calendar is also sitting on a calendar or paper holder, because it's hard to look straight down all the time onto the table. Another human limitation that we have is your neck is going to get really sore if you're having to raise your head up and down constantly throughout the day. Now, to her left, you will see a pen and paper. Just talked about that. 2 more accommodations. She's also wearing, this is an accommodation that was provided her by her office, but she's wearing a watch. People wear watches because if you need to keep track of time, if you have appointments, you're not going to know. So a watch is another accommodation to a basic human limitation we have. If we come to work and we have 3 appointments over an 8-hour period and we're not wearing a watch, we really have no idea whether we're going to be on time, whether people are going to be walking in surprising us, because it is hard for us to keep track of time. That's just a basic human limitation we have. She's going to know what day it is. She's likely going to know it's still the morning, but is she going to know after a couple hours whether it's 10 or 10:45 or 11:15? She would be guessing. So she's also wearing a watch. This woman in this setting has 16 accommodations that have been made for her. 16, so that she can function in an inclusive environment. You know, my wife, my better half, is named Charlene. She is a teacher by training. She is an education administrator today. But if she was here, she would say, when you go into any classroom in America, if you look around the classroom, like we just looked at this woman's office situation, if you look at any teacher's classroom, you would find that there are 14 to 17 accommodations that are being made for each and every teacher in America. 14 to 17 accommodations so that they can teach in an inclusive environment. If you go into a principal's office, Charlene Comstock-Galligan would tell you there are 13 to 16 accommodations that are being made for every principal running a school in America today. Now, when we think about the issue of inclusion for kids, we think about we're going into these meetings. We never think about all the accommodations that have been made for the people in the meeting. Oftentimes, 14 to 17 accommodations for human limitations that they have so that they can function in an inclusive environment. Everyone just wants to focus on the 2 or 3, oftentimes referred to as special accommodations, a kid with a disability needs. But think about this now. Think about asking for 2 or 3 accommodations when you've established at the outset of the meeting that everybody in the room is already getting 14 to 17 accommodations to their human limitations. It makes asking for the 2 or 3 accommodations you're there for a lot more reasonable, doesn't it? But if everyone's just focused on those 2 to 3 and have no context for all the accommodations to their human limitations that have been made in that room, it's only about the 2 or 3 special accommodations for the kid. So this creates a whole new context for the discussion of inclusion. So let me just add that there's 14 to 17 in a classroom. Don't forget the entranceway to a school. Obviously, I hope there's a ramp there. There's likely going to be steps and a ramp. If it's a high school and it's on the second or third floor, there's likely an elevator. You can add those accommodations, which bring most teachers' accommodations closer to 20. So, accommodations. You think we don't use them to be in inclusive environments? Think again. So here's what we know from these, from the exercise we just did. Accommodations are necessary in every community setting. Home. Look around your home today. You'll see a lot of accommodations that are being made to human limitations that we have. Accommodations are made in schools. They're certainly made for the adults. I can guarantee you that. They're not always made for kids, but they are always made for the adults. Our job is to point out those accommodations to adults so that they can see the accommodations for children, adolescents, and young adults with disabilities in a new light. Accommodations are necessary in every work environment. Let's go back. Imagine if we took away all of this woman's accommodations. We took away all 16 of them. She would be in the dark, sitting on the floor. Imagine that. Social settings. Why do we need accommodations? We all need and use accommodations to overcome basic human limitations. Now, what is a disability? A disability literally is nothing more than a basic human limitation. Who has basic human limitations? Everyone. Absolutely everyone, as we just discussed. As humans, we have myriad limitations and we have extensive capabilities. Accommodations, as was noted in the past couple examples, make every human less limited, less disabled. They help us overcome our human limitations, utilize our abilities, and function in inclusive, natural community settings. So here's the bottom line. Accommodations. We all need them. Every single person. Every single day. For community life. Thus, we really are far more alike than we are different. For much of my career, I've gone into IEP meetings, and everyone in the room wanted to talk about how different my client is from them. Makes people feel better about decisions that they make about people who they think are different than them. It can justify things that wouldn't be justifiable to people otherwise. If they think, well, somebody is so different from me, it's okay to treat them differently, because they are so different from me. It's a lot harder to treat somebody different, in a different manner, when you show someone they are really no different than them. So now, what's the justification for treating somebody different? They are just like you. Without the accommodations that they need, and you're no different without the accommodations you need, neither my client, the kid with a disability, nor you, as a teacher, as an administrator, you won't be able to function in an inclusive environment either. You won't be able to work. And my client, this kid with a disability, won't be able to learn without the accommodations he needs. He is exactly the same as you. So, without accommodations, any person can be rendered totally disabled in a matter of seconds. Take away this woman's accommodations, in the dark, on the floor. That's pretty disabled. Okay, so without accommodations, people can be rendered totally disabled in a matter of seconds. We need to stop thinking that some humans are more disabled than others. The reality, all of us have numerous human limitations, and all of us need accommodations to overcome them. That's the reality of life today, for each and every one of us. Our job in advocating for inclusion for kids and adolescents and young adults with disabilities is to ensure that the adults, who oftentimes, almost invariably, have the power and the authority to make the decisions, understand that they are just like children, adolescents, and adults with disabilities, that they are no different, and that their decisions need to be made in the context of the reality that they are exactly the same as any person with a disability. They themselves need accommodations, just like a person with a disability. They themselves have accommodations. I always count them up for people so they know exactly how many accommodations have been provided for them so that they can address their human limitations. And now my client, we're here today to talk about 3 accommodations he needs, in light of the fact, however, that everyone in this room at least has 13, and some of you all in this room have up to 20 accommodations that are being made for you today. That's how I start IEP meetings that I now attend. It creates a different context. So we make accommodations for ourselves so that we can function and live in the community. Adults. Then, as adults, we must make accommodations for students with disabilities so that they can function in inclusive settings in our schools and in our communities. This is just equity, equal protection, fundamental fairness. And trust me, when you talk about inclusion in this manner, people get that. You see the light bulbs going off in people's heads as they begin to realize their own human limitations and how many accommodations they need to function in inclusive settings. Here's another truth. Those who say that inclusion is not important and segregation is okay for persons with disabilities, they never conceive of themselves in segregated settings. They often have a remarkable inability to generalize segregation to their own lives. Segregation is fine for someone else, but not for them, trust me. I've seen this a lot. People who give you 12 reasons why it's okay to segregate a kid with a disability. But if you start giving them examples of them being segregated, oh, no, 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 not me. Fine for someone else, but not for them. So, this is a reality, particularly when you talk with adults. For every person, where one receives services is critically important. And I'm going to give you 3 examples which manifest this. Let's look at this restaurant, Dick and Natalie's. Imagine going out to dinner tonight with your parents. And if you have children, with your children. You're going to Dick and Natalie's. You walk into Dick and Natalie's, somebody's going to be at like a little podium area. You walk up there and say there are like 6 of us. And the person behind the podium, some guy, looks over at your parents and says, oh, I don't know if you know this, but what is your name? Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Comstock Alley. I don't know if you know this, but we've recently created a new elderly section in the restaurant. A section that I think you're really going to love. And here's the deal with our new section. There's a lower waitress-waiter to customer ratio over in our elderly section. It's right down the hallway here. Lower waiter-waitress customer ratio. We have more items on the menu, which we know you're going to love. So you can have more selections. Also, the seating is more flexible for you. I think you're going to find it a lot more comfortable. So there's a lower waiter-waitress to teacher ratio, lower waiter-waitress to customer ratio. Should sound familiar. Lower teacher to pupil ratio. Should ring that bell. There's more items on the menu. There'll be more services down there. And it's going to be accessible. Now, I don't know about your parents, but if someone said that to Cy and Bernice Galligan, my parents, my father, who was never a violent man, would have said to that person, I'm here with my son and daughter-in-law and my granddaughter. There's no way in hell I'm going to an elderly section. I came here to have dinner with my family. And that's where we intend to have dinner. And imagine the person saying, well, no, that's not how it works here. Because of your age, you're going to be in the elderly section. Really, do you think it matters to most people when they're told they have to go to an elderly section that there's a lower waitress-waiter to customer ratio when they're with their family? Do you think it matters that there are more items on the menu when they're with their son and daughter-in-law and their granddaughter? That they're going to be segregated down there, but they have more items on the menu? No, none of that matters. They want to be included with their family. They came to have dinner with their family. Many kids go to school with their brothers and sisters and their friends from their neighborhood. They don't want to end up in school and be confronted with the same thing that my parents were just confronted with in the example. Oh, you're disabled. You have to go to the special ed self-contained classroom because of something about your status. You know what? Where people receive services really matters. It matters to adults, trust me. It would matter in an IEP meeting to anyone in that room who was somebody's parents who that person said that to. Anybody in the room at your IEP meeting who's over 50, when I give this example, starts looking around thinking this could be me. How would I feel? I think we know how they feel. They don't want to be segregated. When it happens to them, it's like, no, no, no. There's no way in hell I'm going to the elderly section. Movie time. Where one receives services is critically important. It matters to kids, and it really matters to adults. Imagine this. Imagine going to the theater tonight. You're with friends. You're three couples. Doesn't matter what your gender is. You're three couples. You're all friends. You walk up to the movie, and you've selected a movie you're going to see. Arrival, a movie that's currently out, or Rogue One, or Fences. But you've chosen a movie. Now you walk up to the theater, and the person behind the glass window says to the women who are in the group, of the six of you, I'm not saying how many women there are, but there are a number of women in the three couples. The person behind the glass window says to you, I don't know if you know it, but all of you women, we have just created a new women's section here at the Paramount 20 theaters. And you know what? We think you're really going to love it. We have done a variety of research, and we have selected 5 of our 20 movies that we think women are most interested in. And you can choose from any of these 5 movies, and you're going to have a great movie experience because we, in the theaters in the women's section, there are clear lines of sight. There's a bigger screen. The seats are plusher. It's just going to be a better experience for you. So, which of these 5 movies would you like to choose from? No, the movie that you just mentioned, that's not one of the 5. You're going to have to choose from one of these 5 movies. Oh, I understand that's a movie you've come to see, but we have our women's section. So, which of the 5 movies that are in our new women's section would you like to see? Now, whether this example uses a women's section or a men's section, imagine, under the example I used, the women's section, imagine being a woman going to a theater with friends, 3 couples, and being told that they have selected the movies that they think you're going to like, and you have to select from the ones they've selected, and that you're going to be segregated in the women's section. Are all those things like clear lines of sight, plusher seats and a bigger screen, is that really going to matter to you? Or is what's going to matter to you is seeing the movie you came to see with your friends? Think about it. What would your reaction be being told that there was a new women's section in the theater where you were going to have to go? I think you would find that outrageous. As well you should. Because if I was told there's a new male section, a new women's section, the new men's section in the theater, I would be outraged. How dare you presume you know what I like? So, where we receive services really matters. The Superdome. I'm talking to you today from New Orleans. The New Orleans football team, the Saints, they play at the Superdome. Imagine this example. Inclusion matters to everyone, as we could tell from the restaurant and the women's theater example. Now imagine this. Imagine again now there's 8 of you going to a Saints game. There's 4 African Americans in your group, 2 whites, 2 Latinos. There's 8 of you. You're friends. That's what America is. We're black, we're white, we're Latino, we're Asian, we're Native American, we're a variety of colors. But in this group, 4 African Americans, 2 whites, 2 Hispanics or Latinos. You walk up to buy your ticket to the Saints game, and the person behind the window says to your 2 Hispanic friends, I don't know if you know this, but here at the Superdomes for the Saints games, we've created a new Hispanic section. That's right. Yeah, we have a new Hispanic section in the Superdome. We think you're really going to like it. Now just think about how this is going over. Because if you're not the Hispanic 2 in your group, imagine being those 2. Now here's the deal with our Hispanic section. The seats are right down by the field, direct lines of sights, and you can actually take, each of you can take 1 person with you. So you're right, I understand that there's 8 of you, but the 2 of you who are Hispanic, you're going to have to sit in that section, and you're each entitled to take 1 person with you. So you're going to have to choose. You're right, you have 6 friends to choose from. You're not going to be able to choose all 6 of them, but you're going to have to choose because you're going to have to sit in the Hispanic section. Imagine how you would feel. Just imagine that. You know, where we receive services really matters. But think about this now. I am a person with a disability. I use an electric scooter. It's called a go-go scooter. If I was in that group, my wife Charlene and our 6 other friends, and I was the 2 white people in that group, but I have a disability, 4 African-American friends of ours and 2 Hispanic, what's going to happen to me when I go up to that window at the Superdome to get seats with my 6 other friends? What am I going to be told? I'm going to be told, excuse me, sir, but I don't know if you know this, but we have a disabled seating section here at the Superdome. 1 disabled seating section. But you're going to like it because it's right down by the field. You're going to be very close to the field, clear lines of sight. It's just going to be an amazing experience for you. Wait a minute, I'm here with my 6 friends. I want to go to the game with them. I'm sorry. You can take 1 person with you. Is that your wife or your girlfriend? I guess, yeah, you'll be taking your wife. What about my other 6 friends? They're not going to be able to go with you. What about other choices where I could sit? No, we don't have those for you. Now imagine, we would find it unconscionable if we went up to the Superdome and someone told us they had a Hispanic seating section, or an African American seating section, or a woman's seating section, or a men's seating section, and that's where people would have to sit based upon their race or their gender. We would find that unconscionable, as well we should. But that is still the reality today for people with disabilities at the Superdome. Why? Because the people running the Superdome think that people with disabilities are far different than people without. Now, after the last 45 minutes, I think we know that's garbage. I, as a person with a disability, I am no different than any of my 6 friends I want to go to the Saints game with, than anybody working at the Superdome, than any other person attending a Superdome game. I need accommodations just like everyone else to get a seat in that stadium, and everyone else who also needs accommodations in order to see a game. They're going to use the elevator, they're going to use steps and all kinds of things to get where they're going. They need accommodations too. They're given hundreds, if not thousands of choices about where to sit. I'm given 1. I'm sorry. That's an outrage. But it's because of the way that we see each other. And I hope you can tell from this presentation today, we have to stop with the way that we see people with disabilities. We are far more alike than we are different. And it is not okay to treat people with disabilities who need exactly the same thing as everyone else, accommodations, in order to be in inclusive settings. It is not okay not to provide them when we provide them to everybody else. So, let's talk about now inclusion itself. You know, definition of inclusion, there are lots of nice, lovely definitions. But you know what? We don't need any definitions about inclusion. I say this all the time at IEP meetings. I don't need to read about some definition of inclusion. Everyone in this room at this IEP meeting is living proof of what inclusion is and what it means. Each and every person at this meeting who I'm theoretically talking to, if I'm at an IEP meeting, you experience inclusion every day as a part of community life. It's a natural component. Now, let's think about for a second, where are some of the places that we feel included in community life? What are some of them? Just think about this. And don't go ahead of a slide. I guess I control the slides. You won't be going ahead. So, where are places that we feel included? Because we experience inclusion as a natural part of community life. All right, think of some of those places. Here we go. We're going to review some. Family. We feel included in our families. We have a sense of belonging and inclusion in our families. At church, for people who go to church. Hopefully at school. The vast majority of kids without disabilities certainly feel included in their schools. That's not always the case for kids with disabilities, however. That's not always their experience. At work, we have a sense of inclusion. In our neighborhoods, we have a sense of inclusion and belonging. And in community organizations, we feel included, a part of. So, we experience inclusion every day. We don't need somebody to tell us what it is. We are living, breathing examples of inclusion. So, take a moment and think of or write 2 words that describe the experience of being included. I'm going to give you 1 minute. What does it feel like when we're included? Part of a family, part of your church if you belong to and go to church. School, work, neighborhood, community organizations. What does it feel like to be included? This is very important. Take another 20 seconds. Write that second word down. Okay, here we go. We are living, breathing examples of inclusion. There are universal truths about living and breathing inclusion on a daily basis. Here are some of the universal truths. The words that we use to describe being included, they tend to be the same words, no matter where you are or who you are. These words on this slide in front of you now is from a group of parents in Fort Worth in 1989 who did this exercise. Here's what they said it felt like to be included during their lives. They were accepted. They felt connected. They felt respected. They felt valued and appreciated. Inclusion made them feel wanted, made them feel contributing, loved, and belonging. Words that I've used to describe it for me, it makes me feel happy. Makes me feel close to others. Closeness. Connected would be the word that's already on you. You out there who wrote down words, you probably have other words. But I guarantee you, if everyone who's watching this seminar would collected their words, these words would be on it. These are some of the universal truths about what it feels like to be included. And it's important that adults, particularly in education, who make decisions about whether kids get included or not, they need to remember what inclusion does for individuals, themselves included in their own life, what it feels like, what it gives them. It gives them a feeling of acceptance, connection, respect, value, appreciation, wanted, contributing, loved, and belonging, happy. This is what inclusion does for us. Do we think it does this only for us as adults? No. When kids are included, this is what they get. How do we know? Because from our own lives, it's what we got when we were included. So, now, think of 2 words and write them down that describe the experience of being excluded or left out. The reality is every adult has experienced exclusion or rejection at some point. Let me give you my example. When I was in 1st grade, every day, I went to a Catholic school. Every day we'd go out, and Sister Mary David would have the boys play dodgeball, and the girls would play hopscotch, jump rope, jacks, all very stereotypical. But I'm old. I'm in my 60s, 65. So this was in the 50s when things were very stereotypical. So the boys, they were like, I was in a big class, around 36 kids. There'd be about 18 of us. We would go out and line up on the fence line in 1st grade. And Sister Mary David would pick 2 kids to be the captains. And then they would pick everybody else on the fence line for dodgeball. Who do you think was picked last every day? Every day. And I told you I have a disability. Then I used to walk on crutches. Today I walk a little bit on crutches, mostly use a scooter. But back then I walked on crutches. So we're playing dodgeball. The last person on that fence line every day was me. Now, are you really selected when you're the last person on a fence line every day? No. Let me tell you how I felt. I felt hurt, and I felt highly embarrassed. And the reality is, those feelings, part of them never goes away. I got to the point after 6 months being the last kid on the fence line that I didn't even want to go to school. I finally told my mother why I didn't want to go to school. Well, she went up to St. Patrick's, and that whole idea about Sister Mary David picking kids who would then select kids and lead me on that fence line as the last kid, that went by the wayside that very day. My mother was outraged because there was such a simple solution that would have made me feel, that would have ensured that I was included rather than excluded every day. Now think about it. What could have been done to make sure that I was like every other kid on that fence line, not the last and only kid on the fence line? My mother told Sister Mary David she needed to start counting kids off by numbers, 1 and 2. You're either number 1 or you're number 2. I was just like every other kid who was number 1, or I was just like every other kid who was number 2. But I was the same as them. And we already know I was the same as them anyway when it came to the issue of accommodations. But I was the same. But I felt hurt, and I felt embarrassed. And damn, I was 6 years old. That's what being excluded made me feel like. So, take 30 seconds, think of and write down a couple words about your own life where you have felt exclusion, you've been excluded or rejected. This happened to us, be it in relationships, be it at work, friendships. It has happened. 20 seconds. What was that experience like? What's a word to describe it? Okay, here's some of the universal truths about exclusion. Same group of parents from Fort Worth, 1989. Here's the words that they used to describe the experience of being excluded or rejected in their lives. They felt pain. They felt alone. They felt despair, rejected, angry, sad, shame, empty. I felt hurt and embarrassed when I was excluded. Now, once again, no matter where you are out there, if we could collect everybody's words across the country, we would find these words on them, or words essentially identical to them, like closeness and connection under the inclusion. We would find pain, hurt. I said hurt, pain. Alone, despair, rejected. We would find these words. Because one of the universal truths about being excluded is that these are the things that we feel. Now, once again, do we think we only feel these things as adults when we're excluded? No. In my view, they're even stronger, these feelings, when we're children and we're excluded, because we haven't built up a lot of defenses. And in many ways, that's a plus and a minus that we haven't. But we haven't. So we experience these, it's even more magnified, the pain, the aloneness, the despair, rejection, the anger, the sadness, the shame, the emptiness, the hurt, the embarrassment. But we know, we don't need to read this, we know when we're excluded from our own lives what that felt like, what it was like. And these words describe it. So, trust me, you want to know why inclusion is important? This is what kids get and what we get as adults when we're included. Acceptance, connection, respect, value, appreciation. We feel wanted. We feel like we're contributing. We feel loved. We feel belonging. We feel happy when we're included. And when we're excluded, kids, they do feel this just like we did. And like we will if we're excluded as adults. We feel pain, alone, despair, rejection, anger, sadness, shame, emptiness, hurt, and embarrassment. So, what's the link to education? We need to intentionally organize and structure our classrooms, our lessons, our activities, our schools, so that students, all students, but really the group that's been left out the most, students with disabilities, experience what's on the left side of the screen: belonging, contribution, connection, respect, acceptance, fulfillment, and appreciation. And when do kids experience this? When they're included. And we need to make sure that kids do not experience isolation, loneliness, shame, pain, helplessness, low self-esteem, anger, or rejection. And when do we know kids experience this? When they are excluded, when they are segregated. It's remarkable to me that I've never done this exercise in a school. It's just remarkable to me when people haven't said to me, God, I never thought of it. I never thought of it that way. And yet, we've all experienced inclusion and rejection, and these feelings are within us as we sit in a room talking about another kid's inclusion or exclusion. That's why, as I noted at the outset, how we think about inclusion, how we talk about inclusion, is really important. Because most people see inclusion as outside of themselves and don't go inside themselves to consider how to look at the issue for a kid within the context of their own experiences. But when confronted, when adults in a room are made to go through these exercises, they see inclusion in a whole different way. And you cannot deny what's on this slide. These are universal truths because why? They didn't come from a book. You know, they didn't come from some conference we went to. These words come from our lives. That's the ultimate truth. Our lives. So, inclusion matters to everyone. Do what you can to make it happen. One last thing. When I go into meetings representing kids with disabilities over the past 37 years, I have read this quote by Herman Hesse hundreds of times, because I also think this quote puts into context the importance of not only inclusion, but of education for every single kid with a disability, as well as every kid. So this is something I think that we oftentimes forget, particularly with kids with disabilities when we go into educational settings. I think we forget this. This is my story. And I say to people in the room, this is a story about Charlie, the kid with a disability that we're here to talk about today, Charlie. This is my story. It is a story of a human, not of an invented or possible, or idealized, or otherwise absent figure, but of a unique being of flesh and blood. Yet, what a real living human being is made of seems to be less understood today than at any time before. Every human is more than just him or herself. He or she, Charlie, represents the unique, the very special, and always significant and remarkable point at which the world's phenomena intersect only once in this way and never again. There is only one Charlie, one out of the more than 4 billion people on this planet. We are here today on behalf of Charlie, and there is no one else on the planet like Charlie. He is the significant and remarkable point at which the world's phenomena intersected only in this way, once, and never will again. That is why Charlie's story is important, why it is eternal, and why it is sacred. So, now that Rogue One has come out, Star Wars is back, let me say this. May the Force be with us, because this is an issue of inclusion. It's a critical issue. Every single human being alive on this planet today. And that is particularly true for all students with disabilities. I hope this presentation has been helpful to you, and that it will teach you that it has lent you some new approaches, new ideas, and given you some new advocacy skills with respect to the issue of inclusion. Thank you very much.